Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, Hansa, for starting this. And hello, everyone, and welcome to our next Manta Talks. Today, we will discuss how to accelerate your migration to Snowflake with data lineage. Jan Ulrych, Manta's Vice President of Research and Education, will tell you how data lineage empowers Snowflake users to have full visibility across all your data flows, how to understand data in full context, and how to eliminate manual processes and capitalize on the value of your Snowflake data. If you have any questions for the speaker, please use the chat that you can see on the side, and we will make sure to answer all of your questions at the end. And I'm not going to prolong it anymore, so I'm going to hand it over to Jan.
Perfect. Thank you, Carolina. So we have about 30 minutes for the webinar, so let's jump right into it. And this is how I'd like to spend these 30 minutes. So basically, first, talk about the migration process in general and some specifics with regards to migration to cloud, about the challenges that there are and how Lineage can help. Talk about the Snowflake itself, just a brief introduction for those who may not be that familiar. And then really focus on how data lineage helps when performing that migration or even planning the migration. And also to finish with how data lineage helps at the end. Once you've migrated, once you have the new environment up and running, ready, is there still a value for metadata? And if time permits, we'll do a brief demo of how that data lineage can help with migration to give a little more hands-on and visual representation of that. So if you're going to have any questions, feel free to post them into the chat, and we'll make sure that we'll address them at the end of this webinar. So speaking about the migrations, I actually borrowed a few quotes from Gartner's report. This is one from February this year. And it actually very nicely describes the typical challenges that organizations have when running the migrations in general, but also migrations to cloud. And the first of them is actually about the growing diversity of the platforms that we're using, right? Several years back, it was just data warehouse and a few systems. Now it's a data lake, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the scope is significantly growing. And with that, it also the risk and cost of the migrations is growing as well. The second one that was really interesting is that the migration teams who are actually responsible for the migration itself to make sure that it's done properly and well can be very easily overwhelmed by the environment, by the complexity and the scale of the migration effort, especially when they go deeper into the weeds and start looking into specific areas to be migrated. And without any surprise, this often leads to delays, but also to the, as Gartner calls it, very fittingly, turbulent post-migration experience for the end users. And that's definitely the last thing that that we want the new users of the new or users of the new system to experience, right? And the last one is actually an outlook for 2022. Where Gartner says that over 50% of the data migration initiatives will exceed the budget and timeline, which is really crazy to think of. So basically, this webinar is about how we can mitigate these risks with using of data lineage. So, speaking about the migration, typically what everybody focuses on is the end result, right? So speaking about the cloud migration or migration to cloud, to Snowflake, we're focusing on what we are going to get, what benefits are waiting for us, like scalability of the platform, basically almost unlimited computing power, elasticity. We can scale up, scale down, right? Almost no setup time, a very simplified ease of access, and that nice feature of Snowflake that provides a zero copy cloning service for data, and so on and so on. So this is all good. But how about the migration process itself? Are we thinking about that sufficiently? And based on the Gartner's research, it seems that not. That basically teams are overrun by the complexity that they discover, that there are shortcuts being made, which leads to future issues when end users start using the system. And if you think about the main issues or main challenges that we have to address during the migrations, it is really about the dependencies between the systems, right? The complexity that comes is the dependencies, where the data are coming from, where the data is being used, and what's actually happening in the system itself. And all of this is basically leading to the data lineage, the data flows. And the other aspect is just making sure that the migration is safe and reliable, right? So we do not want to break anything. We do not want to miss anything. Ideally, we do not want to migrate what's not needed anymore, some sort of legacy items or legacy data sets that are not being used anymore. And as we're typically migrating very large systems, we need to run the migration in phases, which means it's not just one weekend, but it may be a set of weekends over a month or over a year to actually complete the migration end to end, which is very demanding. We need to make some changes during that time as well, right? So how do we actually address it? The answer that I want to talk about today, and that's definitely just part of the answer, but very important one, is data lineage, because data lineage basically streamlines the migration. It simplifies the whole process by getting the understanding ahead of time instead of retrospectively during the migration process. So what actually is data lineage? Data lineage is basically an understanding of how your data flows, of your data pipelines. So as you can see on the illustration over here on the in the picture, the data flows are those pipelines that go from left to right, and we have one source that's highlighted in black, and we can see how the data is actually disseminated from that single source into different pipelines, into different systems, and where it's actually being used. And the huge benefit of data lineage is that when you have this information in advance before the migration starts, you can actually do quite a lot with that to reduce the risks. And I will talk about additional value of data lineage towards the end of the webinar, not just for the migration. So this webinar is titled Migration to Snowflake and how data lineage automates that. So what actually is Snowflake? Snowflake is a cloud computing platform that is designed for various data operation tasks and different uses. So it started as a data warehouse, but it supports data lake uses, it supports data science, reporting, analytics, and so on. A huge benefit of Snowflake is definitely that zero copy cloning capability. So basically, you can create copies of data without actually copying the data itself, which makes it just much faster. And when you actually update the original data, you get your copy updated as well. And that's a huge benefit. Basically, none of the on-premise databases can do this for you. So with this in mind, Snowflake is becoming really one of the leading platforms in the data analytics space. All right, so why do we care about metadata automation with automation in focus? Really, the most important thing is to understand that as Gartner says over here, and I should probably give a bit of time to read the quote. But basically, as Gartner says, as you step into the migration, typically you start with a high-level estimate of what the effort is going to be. But that estimate is then precised with the further steps of or further phases of the migration itself. And as it says over here, basically only after you finish the analytics phase of the migration, so basically once you're about 1/3 through the migration project, only at that point you actually find out the actual cost of the migration itself, right? So in other words, you have to do really a lot of work in advance to be able to assess the cost and in the end, basically calculate the business case for the migration in the first place, right? And that's actually really scary because basically you're sort of walking in the dark until you find out much later what it's going to be. And this is definitely something that your business owners do not like to hear and do not like to see. So the goal here is really to try to understand and estimate the cost and the approach very accurately, much sooner in the process, ideally before we really start, right? So what do we actually need to consider before we start migrating or while we're migrating? Basically, you can think of the migration as this regular path that you're following, and that's the traditional type of approach. And we are trying to streamline it, right? Make it much more easy to navigate and ideally know it in advance. So first of all, we're dealing with lots of legacy systems. These legacy systems have been implemented for past 20, 30 years. And it's not just the system that we're migrating over to Snowflake, but it's also the systems that are touching that migrated system, right? So systems that are feeding data and systems that are actually consuming the data. So we need to understand the dependencies between those. And most importantly, we need to understand the current state of those interfaces and of those interactions, because as they were designed quite a few years back, very likely they have changed and they are working very differently now. We already talked about the inaccurate effort estimates, basically because we do not have enough information about those systems. We are making just high-level estimates based on high-level understanding of the metadata and of the systems and their interconnections. So that's something that we need to change. We need to go much deeper very early on without much effort, right? Same thing basically is about incomplete understanding of the scope and impact, because we do not know how the systems are exactly connected, right? We understand it on the high level, but we do not know the details. We may be very easily missing some things, and we only get to them during the analysis phase, where we actually find out that this particular data set is also consumed by Joe's system, and we need to migrate that one as well, right? So again, Lineage information and the understanding of the data flows gives this information in advance. Data dependencies across the environment we already talked about. Lack of internal knowledge. As these systems have been developed over years, people who were originally part of the implementation or design team may be long gone or have moved to different roles and so on and so on. So basically that internal knowledge is sort of fading out in many areas, especially in terms of why things were designed in a particular way, or what may be one-off cases that, for example, did not go through properly through previous migration. Outdated documentation, we are all very familiar with that, and so on and so on. So overall, all of these basically lead to unexpected surprises that result in delayed timelines, extended scope, and such extended budget. So how do we actually overcome these? We really address these with the data lineage by having the systems and not just the migrated system, but the environment analyzed ahead of time, so that we can actually perform automated analysis of the environment to assess the complexity and the scope of what's going to be migrated, and to decide on how we want to define the phases, migration phases, right? And I'll show that during the demo. So once the migration is actually completed, do we still have any use for metadata, and how beneficial they are? Does all of this work to get the metadata prior to migration for a system that we're about to decommission make sense? Does it really pay off? And the answer to that is yes, it does. Because you're migrating just part of your environment, right? So when you migrated, let's say, your SQL Teradata data warehouse into Snowflake, plus part of your analytics, but the rest of the environment remains. So your CRM, your online sources, all of these remain, and you're just feeding them into a different place. So you still have these systems, and whenever you touch them, it makes sense to keep them updated and to have the metadata about them available. And basically, on the high level, if you look at the business value and business additions of the metadata automation, you're basically able to deliver faster, hence, for example, gain market share quicker. You can boost business agility, so again, deliver faster, implement projects with lower risk, and so on and so on. So how do we actually do it with the Snowflake, and what's a more concrete value that you can extract from it? So first of all, Agile data workflows. Basically, anytime you're working with a system, anytime you're touching it, you need to understand what you're changing. So similarly as during the migration process, when you actually were to assess the scope of the change and the effort that's associated with it, that it will require, maybe even testing required, teams that you will need to even interact with. That's all the same after the migration when you're making the changes to the new environment. So in the Snowflake environment, you still need to do the changes, and you need to do them efficiently. And again, as mentioned at the beginning, as the variability of the environment grows and you're adding new systems, the risk simply increases. So with keeping the data lineage and metadata automated and up to date, you're changing the process and making it better for the future cases. On the cost side, you can actually save a lot on the integration testing, because in many cases, customers tend to do a lot of integration testing. That is sort of a shared resource over the organization. And with this integration testing, if you don't know well what you need to test, in many cases, you simply test more just to be safe rather than test what's needed. And again, with understanding of the data flows, what's being impacted and affected, you can actually do the testing much more safer in a smaller and a more limited scope, which also helps again with the agility. If you test small scope, you can deliver fast, right? And overall, you can actually build a lot of automation tasks, for example, for the impact analysis, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Enhanced trust in the data. Basically the biggest challenge in adopting new technologies and really getting value out of them is insufficient trust in data. You know, this new system that has been implemented, does it really do what it's supposed to do? Does it take the data from the right source? Especially if you deliver a few, maybe not 100% correct results or consistent results, the trust in data simply drops, and trust in your system simply drops, right? So with having data lineage available, you can actually even visually show where the data is coming from, what operations have been made on the data, and how the data is actually being used further. So with that, simply building this transparency, it gives your data scientists, your business analysts, your business consumers much more trust in what they are actually looking at, and confirm that you know what you're doing. The second reason is really, as the last point over here says, self-service. I do not want to put here another quote from Gartner, but if you read about the distribution of time, how data scientists and business analysts spend time when working on a specific project, it turns out that a large amount of the time is spent on actually finding the right data, or validating that the data that they are about to use is from the correct source, or has not been anyhow changed, or if changed, then how it was actually changed. So basically, data scientists, instead of doing the true data science, they are simply tracing the data back to the source to confirm that it is the data that they are supposed to be using. Again, this is a lot of time in terms of duration, and a lot of effort that we're simply paying for without actually bringing any additional value, or without bringing enough additional value. Data lineage, in this case, with the enhanced trust in data, helps both of these groups to get the understanding of the data flows and where the data is coming from, what they went through, and if any questions are needed, then the data scientist can focus on asking the right person the right question, because the data scientist sees that there's a specific transformation applied somewhere in the process, but they can focus on the transformation instead of focusing on the whole flow and discussing the whole flow. And the last but not least, data lineage significantly helps with regulatory compliance. There are financial regulatory requirements, especially for banks, like BCBS 239 about risk and so on, but also regulations like GDPR and CCPA about personal data that are focused about where the data is, how you're processing the data, right? So where the personal data, where you collect the personal data, and how you use it throughout the organization. And if you're using it properly, for example, if you are doing anonymization, if you are using encryption, if the systems that are using the data have the right consents for that particular use. And again, without not understanding where you use that data and where it disseminates even dynamically throughout the environment, it is very hard to comply with these regulations, right? So definitely one of the advantages of using data lineage is actually being able to comply with the GDPR, CCPA, or BCBS much more easily, because you are in the control of the data. Excellent. So these were sort of three highlights of how data lineage helps. There are definitely more, but that would be out of the webinar scope. So let's move on to the live demonstration quickly. Let me just share my screen. All right. So we're looking at Manta, and currently I'm looking at the quite recent snapshot of the repository that already has the Snowflake. But as we're talking about the migration, let's take a look at the case where there was no Snowflake, right? So this is pre-migration. And that's exactly the situation that you run into. You have your environment, you can see lots of systems over here, and you're trying to migrate that one. So let's pick a specific data asset. It's called CRM client over here, so that we can take a look at how this CRM client table is actually being used. And this is probably very similar visualization as we've seen on the picture. You can see that this is our source, and now we can see how it disseminates into other systems. Basically, each color represents a different system. So we have at least 1, 2, 3, 4 systems here. And in fact, if we dive a little bit deeper, we may find out that there are actually more systems that may not have been hidden for clarity. Right? So this is immediately a huge value that you're getting, because without actually doing almost any work, you see how the data propagates throughout the environment. And that's something that you can use immediately. Now, let's assume that you're about to migrate this green system over to Snowflake. So what do we need to understand about the system in that case? We need to understand how large it is, how the data flows through that system, and what happens to the data, right? So if I zoom in over here, I can see that, for example, this customer name is actually being calculated here, right? It's being calculated or created from the family name and first name. So immediately, this is something that can help you with assessing the scope and complexity of the migration, because you can programmatically capture the number of transforming attributes compared to non-transforming attributes that are simply transferred as is, right, without any change in the system. Similarly, you can programmatically actually assess how many consumers this data element actually has, right? We have at least 1, 2, 3, 4 consumers that we need to talk to and understand how they are using the data, right? We may have some end user reports that we need to validate after the migration. So all of this information can actually be accessed, not just visually like we're doing over here, but also programmatically to give you metrics. And you can use these metrics to assess the complexity of the migration and associate it with the effort. You can, for example, aggregate the transformations that are happening in the environment to simple, medium, and complex. And with that, you can associate them with a specific number of hours that you need for them to actually rewrite the code for them and to migrate them. Right? Similarly, it actually helps you assess the integration testing. Over here, you immediately see, here's my connection to a reporting tool, SSRS reporting tool that I will need to test against. And I have one, in this case, this demo case, I have just 2 objects that I need to test, right? So I don't need to test everything. I just need to test these specific 2 objects. So I can very much significantly narrow down the scope of the migration. And if I go back and move on to the after the migration environment, I can actually do a very similar thing. I can actually take a look at my CRM client table that I started with, and I can take a look how it looks in the new environment. So in this case, I'm looking at the just the Snowflake instance of the table. I see that it's still sources from my Oracle system, from the red one, as you've seen before. But I can see the flow through that Snowflake environment, how it lands in the targets report that I wanted to validate and test through the integration. And again, I can go deeper and take a look at the individual column level that may help me in the future when I'm touching the customer name. I have all the information available and ready for the use next time, for next migration, for next change, for implementing a new data science project, and so on and so on.
Awesome. Is that it, Jan?
That's basically it. So the key takeaways from this webinar are really that data lineage is a key to speed up the migration, reduce the risk, and make sure that you know what you're getting yourself or your teams into without surprises in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for covering such a broad topic in just such a limited time. I can see there are already some questions in the chat, so I just want to encourage the rest of you, if you have any questions, now is the time to put them there, and we'll make sure to answer them all. So let's go to the first one. George is asking how implementation on existing Snowflake solution works and how much time does it take?
Perfect. Right. So as discussed, you can deploy Manta on the Snowflake itself, but also on the larger environment where you cover multiple systems. When we're talking about the Snowflake itself, you would install Manta, configure connection to your Snowflake, select which data warehouses, databases you want to have analyzed, and just run the scan. So provided that you have all the privileges, that you have all the access and so on that Manta requires to do the work, the implementation can be done in, well, technically in hours, but realistically it's typically more about a week of time to make sure that you get all the access.
Okay. The second question is it also working when ETL orchestration is outside of Snowflake? Is it based on script history?
Excellent question. So with Manta, we support several technologies. We have scanners basically for each technology, for database technologies, for ETL technologies, for reporting tools. So depending on what ETL tool you would be using, it may be supported out of the box, or you have always option to ingest the metadata from other sources, or like custom metadata into Manta as well. And Manta is reading the scripts that are stored in the Snowflake, or potential external scripts that you run against the Snowflake instead of the script history. The reason is that only by analyzing all the scripts, even those that may execute only once a year or once a month, you get full lineage, right? So basing the lineage on the script history only is good, but it may not show you everything.
Okay. And the last question I see here is customization enabled or required?
Right. So with the customizations, it really depends on what kind of customization we are talking about. Definitely, if you need to ingest metadata from sources that are not supported by Manta out of the box, that's definitely possible. There's an API for it where you can load the metadata in. Yeah, I guess that's it. Definitely, George, if you want to discuss in more detail, feel free to reach out, and we can have a more detailed session to answer the questions in more interactive manner, I guess.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, I think that we covered it all today. We are only 4 minutes later than we were suspected, but thank you very much. Thank you all for staying with us until the very end, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.